Welcome to English Story Hub. Learn English through fun stories. Improve vocabulary, listening, and speaking skills. Like, subscribe, and keep learning with us.
Hitler Studies. A Field of Amateurs. Part 3. The gist of the debate, although not directly mentioned, was Trevor Roper's charge a third of a century earlier that historians were evading the problem of Hitler. This point was most clearly made by Martin Brossat in 1987, when he charged that the older generation of German historians very often resorted to writing about a demonic or diabolical Hitler and the like as a consequence of their inability to offer historical explanations. In contrast with this, Brossat insisted there has long been a need for more rational explanation. Brossat opposed what he called history by metaphor, arguing that such an evasive approach to history tended to impede further questioning rather than furnish answers. This, of course, was precisely what the Englishman, Trevor Roper, had argued a third of a century earlier, in 1953. Nor was it an entirely new claim in German scholarship. A decade before, Karl Dietrich Breker had accused historians of a falsification of history in relation to Hitler that he called Genghis Khanism. With such an attitude, Breker argued how difficult it is to understand and explain the rise of a man from so narrow and parochial an existence to a formidable figure on whom depended a development of such universally historical dimensions and consequences. The failure to properly research and provide a coherent account of Hitler had provoked a civil war among historians. The Historikerstreit went on for several years and produced some remarkable characterizations of professional historians, or at least the dominant professional historians in Germany. Foremost among these critics was Joachim Fest, who referred to the latter as keepers of the seal, who had become the mandarins of myths. Because of their attitudes, he charged Hitler and National Socialism, despite years of study and reflection, have remained more myth than history. Essentially, the Historikerstreit boiled down the soup of Hitler studies into two insoluble lumps. One lump claimed that Hitler, the Nazis, the Third Reich, and the Holocaust were unique in all history, and could not be compared to or explained in terms of any other previous human experience. This lump also argued that Hitler was so irrational and illogical that nothing that he did could ever make sense or be explained. The other lump claimed that the simplest rules that are in effect for every past have been suspended, and that while Hitler may have been both mad and evil, nevertheless who he was and what he did could be reduced to history and made explainable to ordinary mortals. Thus, to one lump, Hitler sits astride history like a supernatural, evil demon, defying rationality and explanation, while the other lump argues that Hitler was nothing but just one more, albeit horrible, event in human history that can and should be subject to explanation just like all other events. However much the Historikerstreit stirred up the waters of academe, it nonetheless failed to produce any major, newly researched, and scholarly biography of Hitler. Thus in 1998, when Ron Rosenbaum published his foray into the world of Hitler studies, explaining Hitler. The search for the origins of his evil, he could only report that the real search for Hitler, the search for who he thought he was, and why he did what he did, has been an expedition into a realm far more inaccessible than the rainforest jungles of Argentina. Rosenbaum describes the state of Hitler studies as a terra incognita where armies of scholars clash in evidentiary darkness. The evidentiary darkness, to which Rosenbaum refers, is precisely the failure of professional historians to document and preserve the sources and testimony discussed in the first part of this article. Theodor Mommsen is turning over in his grave. Thus we had to wait until 1998, 53 years after the death of Hitler, 45 years after the first biography of Hitler by a professional historian, 22 years after the last major biography by a non-professional, and 12 years after the beginning of the Historiker Strait for a second professional historian to venture a newly researched biography of Hitler. This was Ian Kershaw, whose first volume, Hitler, Hubris 1889–1936, was published in 1998, followed by the second volume, Hitler, Nemesis 1936–1945 in 1999. Unfortunately, however, this work turned out to be a major disappointment. While excellently researched and engagingly written, the author admits in the introduction that he is without a clue as to how to answer the questions Trevor Roper accused historians of evading. Kershaw, however, at least acknowledges the problem. How do we explain how someone with so few intellectual gifts and social attributes, someone no more than an empty vessel outside his political life, unapproachable and impenetrable even for those in close company, incapable, it seems, of genuine friendship, without the background that bred high office, without even any experience of government before becoming rich Chancellor, could nevertheless have such an immense historical impact, could make the entire world hold its breath? Rather than attempting to answer this question, however, Kershaw does exactly what Trevor Roper accused professional historians of doing. He immediately evades it, asserting that it is falsely posed. Instead, Kershaw declares that Hitler, in a famous phrase borrowed from Winston Churchill, is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Therefore, Kershaw argues, there is no need to explain him. To a professional historian, it seems, a mystery is not something to be solved, uncovered, revealed, or explained. It is simply another datum to be worked in with all the other facts, and treated as though it, too, were a fact. Thus Kershaw's biography proceeds to tell not the story of Hitler the man, which is what biography is supposed to be, but only the story of Hitler's power. The character of his power, the power of the Führer, Kershaw's emphasis. In other words, Kershaw treats Hitler as nothing more than the effects he caused, insisting mysteriously that there was no one behind the effects. When Kershaw seeks to go behind the power of the Führer to explain who this man was and how he did it, he finds nothing, only what he calls a void or a black hole. There was no private life for Hitler, he insists. Kershaw fails not only to provide a coherent narrative, but insists that the most stupendous effects of the 20th century were all caused by the little man who wasn't there. What has been the result of the failure of historians to weave a narrative of the facts of Hitler's life and career, a duty that Theodor Mommsen laid upon them as part of the essence of their profession? It is that Adolf Hitler continues to stand athwart the stream of history as the most mysterious man who ever lived, frustrating all efforts of the best and wisest academicians of the age to explain him or to fit the experience of the 20th century into narrative history. Ron Rosenbaum was the first journalist to sense a significant story in the failure of historians to render a coherent account of Hitler. Rosenbaum researched the literature and interviewed a dozen of the most prominent scholars in the field of Hitler studies in order to document the scandal, that's my word not Rosenbaum's, involved in the failure of historians to explain Hitler. In explaining Hitler, The Search for the Origins of His Evil, 1997, Rosenbaum charges that Hitler has simply escaped explanation, Rosenbaum's emphasis. Rosenbaum writes eloquently of his amazement at what he found to be the state of Hitler studies. Is it conceivable, more than half a century after Hitler's death, after all that's been written and said, that we are still wandering in this trackless wilderness, this garden of forking paths, with no sight of our quarry? Or, rather, alas, with too many quarries? The search for Hitler has apprehended not one coherent, consensus image of Hitler but rather many different Hitlers, competing Hitlers, conflicting embodiments of competing visions. Hitlers who might not recognize each other well enough to say, "Hail," if they came face to face in hell. Among professional historians, Rosenbaum describes what he calls 3 levels of despair induced by the failure to explain Hitler. The most extreme level he calls the revolt against explanation itself. Some historians seriously hold that any attempt to explain Hitler is immoral. These historians insist that Hitler must forever remain a mystery, and that history must never attempt to explain him. Any explanation is considered, reports Rosenbaum, dangerous, forbidden, a transgression of near-biblical proportions. Theodor Mommsen is now doing cartwheels in his grave. The second level of despair, which Rosenbaum labels moderate, is based on the inability of historians to find any narrative into which Hitler fits or any new theory to explain him. It is the general consensus of historians that Hitler is simply not explainable by the systems of explanation, historical and psychological, that we use to explain ordinary human behavior. Thus it is considered moderate. To acknowledge the bankruptcy of imagination of the historical profession, in its failure to find any narrative understandable to ordinary human beings or any credible explanation of the most stupendous events of the 20th century. Shortly after the rise of Hitler, Hermann Göring boastfully predicted that, in later time the historians will not know how to depict it. For the first time in world history the historians will conclude that did not happen by the normal process. It seems to be the position of moderate historians today that Göring was right. Rosenbaum calls the third level of despair that he found among professional historians evidentiary despair. This is the argument that, while it is not impossible to explain Hitler in theory, it has become impossible because the evidence has disappeared. In other words, historians excuse their profession for its collective failure to explain Hitler by arguing that, while the possibility may once have existed, it is no longer possible because too many crucial witnesses have died without giving testimony, because too much evidence was not collected in time, or because too many memories have faded. This brings us full circle. The third level of despair not only admits the truth of the second charge against professional historians, the failure to weave the facts into a coherent narrative, but also proves the first charge, the failure to investigate and preserve evidence. Conclusion. Returning to the image with which this article began, imagine that Osama bin Laden had been killed during America's invasion of Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, and that the entire network of Al-Qaeda leaders were captured and put on public trial, ending forever their terrorist threat to the world. Imagine further that all of the records of Al-Qaeda were captured and made available to scholars, including thousands of pages of writings by Osama bin Laden himself, as well as large numbers of books, memoirs, and reminiscences by his childhood friends, associates, and confederates. Is it possible that professional historians would for the next 60 years fail to interview the people who knew him, refuse to write scholarly biographies of the man, ignore the records, pronounce the entire event inexplicable, and leave the research of these events to amateurs? If they would, then Osama bin Laden would undoubtedly grow into a man of mystery and fascination to the general public, just as Hitler has. The 21st century would be explained by historians like the 20th. One inexplicable catastrophe after another, all caused by unpersons. In summary, the responsibility for the fact that Hitler is still a mystery, and that public interest in him is high and growing, is at least partly caused by the failure of professional historians to carry out the responsibilities of their profession. They have failed, at least according to the two minimal criteria established by Theodor Mommsen. 1. To investigate and preserve the evidence, and 2. To weave the facts into a coherent narrative.